The September afternoon fell softly over the Portland suburb when Margaret Harper opened the door and found Sarah standing on the porch, her eyes red and 2 suitcases at her feet. The children, 4-year-old Emma and little 2-year-old Noah, clung to their mother's legs as if sensing something terrible in the air. Sarah didn't need to say anything. Margaret already knew that distant look, that expression of someone who had made an irreversible decision and was now trying to gather the courage to execute it. The silence between them stretched like a taut rope about to snap, while the autumn wind carried dried leaves across the lawn, creating a sound that seemed like a warning whisper. Margaret felt her heart tighten in her chest, a premonition that this moment would divide her life into before and after. Sarah knelt down and kissed each child's forehead with a desperation that made Margaret's blood run cold. "I need you to take care of them for a while, Margaret," she whispered, her voice breaking like fragile glass. "Just a few days, I promise." But there was something in her tone, in the way her hands trembled as she touched her children's faces one last time, that betrayed the lie. Margaret wanted to ask questions, wanted to grab her daughter-in-law by the shoulders and demand answers. But the words died in her throat when she saw the terror in Sarah's eyes. It wasn't the look of someone planning a brief trip. It was the look of someone saying goodbye forever, of someone fleeing from something so dark that not even a mother's love could make her stay. The children began to cry when Sarah stood up and backed toward the porch steps, her hands raised as if trying to hold an invisible image of them in her palms. "Mommy loves you. Always remember that," she said, her voice now barely audible over the children's sobs. Margaret held Emma and Noah, one in each arm, feeling their little bodies shake with confusion and fear. Sarah turned and walked quickly to the old blue sedan parked at the curb, not looking back even once, as if a single glance might break her resolve. The engine roared to life, and in seconds the car disappeared around the corner, taking with it any explanation, any hope of understanding what had just happened. That night, Margaret sat in the living room with the sleeping children beside her, their tear-stained faces finally peaceful in slumber. She tried calling Sarah's cell phone 17 times, each call going straight to voicemail, each beep another nail in the coffin of her hope. Her son, Michael, Sarah's husband, had died in a construction accident 6 months earlier, and since then, Sarah had become a ghost of herself, hollow and distant. Margaret had noticed the changes, the weight loss, the dark circles under her eyes, the way she would stare out windows as if searching for something on an invisible horizon. But she never imagined it would come to this, that Sarah would simply vanish, leaving her children behind like unwanted baggage at a train station. The days turned into weeks, the weeks into months, and Sarah never returned, never called, never sent a single sign of life. Margaret reported her disappearance to the police, who opened an investigation that led nowhere. Sarah had withdrawn all her money from the bank, packed her essentials, and disappeared without a trace. Margaret transformed the guest room into a children's room, enrolled Emma in kindergarten, and learned to change diapers again at 62 years old. She told herself it was temporary, that Sarah would come back, that there was a reasonable explanation for all of this. But deep in her heart, in that dark place where truths we don't want to face hide, Margaret knew she was lying to herself. Sarah was gone, and whatever had driven her away was powerful enough to make her abandon the 2 people she loved most in the world. 8 years passed like a river that starts turbulent and gradually becomes calm, carving its path through stone with patient persistence. Emma was now 12, a bright girl with her father's green eyes and a wisdom beyond her years, forged in the absence of answers about her mother. Noah had just turned 10, a boy full of energy who barely remembered Sarah's face. Only fragments of sensations, the smell of her perfume, the melody of her voice singing lullabies. Margaret had become their mother in every way that mattered, attending school meetings, nursing fevers at 3 a.m, teaching Emma to braid her hair and Noah to tie his shoes. The house on Maple Street had filled with new memories, pushing the ghosts of the past into increasingly dark corners where they waited patiently for the moment to return. But the past never stays buried forever, no matter how many layers of normalcy we pile on top of it. On a gray Tuesday morning in March, when Margaret was preparing breakfast and the children were getting ready for school, a black sedan parked in front of the house. 2 people got out, a woman in her 40s with a severe expression and a briefcase, and a man in a cheap suit who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Margaret watched them through the kitchen window, her hands freezing over the pan of eggs, her heart beginning to race with an ancient, familiar fear. She knew, even before they rang the doorbell, even before they showed their identification as social workers from Child Protective Services, that Sarah had finally sent her message from beyond the silence. The woman who introduced herself as Linda Morrison sat on the living room sofa with the rigidity of someone carrying out an unpleasant but necessary task. "Mrs. Harper, we received a formal complaint regarding the custody of Emma and Noah Thompson," she said, her voice cold and bureaucratic as ice. Margaret felt the ground disappear beneath her feet, felt reality tilt at a dangerous angle. "A complaint? From whom?" she managed to ask, her voice sounding strange to her own ears. Linda exchanged a quick glance with her colleague before responding. "From Sarah Thompson, the children's biological mother. She's requesting full custody and alleging that you are illegally retaining her children." The words hit Margaret like physical blows, each syllable a knife twisting in her chest. Sarah was alive. After 8 years of absolute silence, of sleepless nights wondering if her daughter-in-law was dead in a ditch somewhere, Sarah was alive and wanted the children back. "Where is she? Where has she been all this time?" Margaret demanded, her voice rising with anger and pain accumulated over years. But Linda just shook her head, her expression impassive as carved marble. "I'm not at liberty to discuss Mrs. Thompson's personal details. What I can tell you is that a custody hearing has been scheduled for 2 weeks from today. You'll need to retain a lawyer, Mrs. Harper. This is a serious legal matter." After they left, Margaret sat in the empty living room, her hands shaking so violently she had to clasp them together to make them stop. Emma appeared in the doorway, her school backpack still on her shoulders, her face pale and frightened. "Grandma, who were those people?" "What did they want?" The innocence in her granddaughter's eyes broke something inside Margaret, something that had been holding firm all these years. How could she explain that the mother who had abandoned them, who had left them crying on a September afternoon 8 years ago, now wanted them back? How could she explain that the law might force them to return to a woman who was little more than a stranger, a shadow in their childhood memories? Margaret pulled Emma into a tight embrace, smelling the strawberry shampoo in her hair, feeling the rapid beating of her young heart, and knew she would fight to the death before letting anyone take these children from her. The lawyer Margaret hired, a woman named Patricia Reeves with 30 years of family law experience, didn't sugarcoat the reality of the situation. "The biological mother has immense advantages in these cases, Margaret," she explained during their first meeting in her downtown office, surrounded by law books that seemed to judge from the shelves. "Unless we can prove she's unfit or that returning the children to her care would cause them significant harm, the court will likely rule in her favor." Patricia's words echoed in Margaret's mind like a death sentence, each syllable a reminder that love and dedication weren't always enough in the eyes of the law. She had raised these children, had been there for every scraped knee, every nightmare, every small triumph and devastating disappointment, but none of that might matter when compared to the sacred bond of biology. The days leading up to the hearing were a waking nightmare, each hour stretching like taffy while simultaneously racing toward the inevitable confrontation. Margaret couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, spending her nights staring at the ceiling and remembering Emma's first day of school, Noah's first word, the thousands of small moments that had woven her life together with theirs. She looked at old photographs, her son Michael's smiling face looking back at her from frames scattered throughout the house, and wondered what he would think of all this, what he would want for his children. Emma had become quiet and withdrawn, her usual brightness dimmed by the uncertainty that hung over the house like storm clouds. Noah, sensing the tension but not fully understanding it, clung to Margaret more than usual, as if afraid she might vanish the way his mother had. The morning of the hearing arrived wrapped in rain, the sky weeping as if mourning what was to come. Margaret dressed in her best navy suit, her hands shaking as she tried to button her blouse, her reflection in the mirror showing a woman who had aged a decade in 2 weeks. Patricia met her at the courthouse, the imposing granite building that seemed designed to make ordinary people feel small and insignificant. "Remember, stay calm, answer questions directly, and show the judge how much you love these children," Patricia instructed as they climbed the steps. But Margaret's attention was already elsewhere, drawn to the woman standing near the entrance, partially hidden beneath an umbrella. Sarah Thompson looked nothing like the broken woman who had disappeared 8 years ago. She had gained weight, looked healthy, her hair styled professionally, wearing an expensive dress that spoke of financial stability. But it was her eyes that struck Margaret most. They were hard now, calculating, missing the warmth that had once made her such a loving mother. Next to Sarah stood a man in an expensive suit, presumably her lawyer, and behind them, a woman Margaret didn't recognize, middle-aged with nervous eyes that darted around the courthouse steps like a trapped bird. Their gazes met for a brief electric moment. Sarah's expression unreadable, Margaret's a mixture of rage, betrayal, and desperate hope that this was all a terrible misunderstanding. Inside the courtroom, the air was thick with tension and the smell of old wood and floor polish. Judge Catherine Morrison, a stern woman in her 60s with gray hair pulled back in a tight bun, presided from her bench with the authority of someone who had seen every variation of human tragedy. Sarah's lawyer, a shark in Armani named Robert Blackwell, painted a picture of a woman who had suffered a mental breakdown after her husband's death, who had made the difficult decision to seek treatment, and who had spent 8 years rebuilding her life so she could be the mother her children deserved. My client has steady employment, a stable home, and has completed extensive therapy, he declared, his voice resonating through the courtroom like a sermon. She deeply regrets the pain her absence caused, but she's now ready to reunite with her children and provide them with the maternal love they need and deserve. Patricia Reeves rose to cross-examine Sarah, her movements deliberate and precise as a surgeon preparing for a delicate operation. Mrs. Thompson, you left your children 8 years ago without any explanation, without any contact. Can you tell the court why you never called, never sent a letter, never attempted to see them even once during all that time? Sarah's composure cracked slightly, her hands gripping the witness stand until her knuckles turned white. I was very ill, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I was suffering from severe depression and anxiety. I knew if I heard their voices, if I saw them, I wouldn't be able to continue with my treatment. I had to completely disconnect to heal. The explanation sounded rehearsed, polished by her lawyer into something that might pass for reasonable to someone who hadn't lived through those 8 years of silence. But Margaret had lived through them, and she knew there was something wrong with Sarah's story, something that didn't fit, like a puzzle piece forced into the wrong space. Patricia pressed further, her questions becoming sharper, more pointed. During these 8 years of healing, did you ever send money to support your children? Did you inquire about their well-being through any third party? Did you leave any instructions? Any indication that you intended to return? Each question hung in the air like an accusation, and Sarah's answers became increasingly defensive, increasingly vague. Margaret watched from her seat, her heart pounding, hoping the judge could see what she saw. That Sarah's story was a carefully constructed lie, a facade hiding something much darker. Then came the moment that would haunt Margaret for the rest of her life. Robert Blackwell called his star witness, Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore, Sarah's neighbor from 8 years ago. The nervous woman Margaret had seen on the courthouse steps took the stand, her hands twisting a tissue into shreds. Eleanor testified that she had known Sarah well, that they had been close friends in the months before Sarah disappeared. Sarah was terrified, Eleanor said, her voice quavering but clear. She told me that Margaret was trying to take her children away, that Margaret had always resented her marriage to Michael and saw the children as her second chance to control someone. The words struck Margaret like bullets, each one tearing through her sense of reality. Mrs. Harper would come over constantly, criticizing Sarah's parenting, telling her she wasn't good enough, Eleanor continued, gaining confidence as she spoke. Sarah was afraid that if she didn't leave, Margaret would find a way to have her declared an unfit mother and take legal custody. She left the children with Margaret temporarily because she was promised it would be just a few days while she got help. But when she tried to come back, Margaret threatened her, told her she would make sure Sarah never saw her children again if she didn't disappear. Margaret felt the courtroom spin around her, felt Patricia's hand grip her arm to keep her from standing up and shouting that it was all lies, that none of it had happened that way. The judge's eyes had shifted, had taken on a new quality of scrutiny, as if Margaret had transformed before her from a loving grandmother into something sinister. Patricia's cross-examination of Eleanor was aggressive, almost brutal. Mrs. Whitmore, you claim to have been Sarah's close friend, yet you never reported these alleged threats to the police? You never contacted Child Protective Services? You simply watched a woman supposedly flee in terror and did nothing? Eleanor stammered, her story beginning to unravel under the pressure. I didn't know what to do. Sarah made me promise not to tell anyone. She said it would make things worse. But the damage was done. The seed of doubt had been planted in the judge's mind. And Margaret could see it growing, spreading its roots through the foundation of everything she had built over the past 8 years. As court adjourned for the day, Margaret stumbled out into the rain, Patricia beside her, both women knowing that the battle had just become infinitely more complicated, infinitely more dangerous. That night, Margaret sat in Emma's room, watching her granddaughter sleep, memorizing the curve of her cheek, the way her hair spread across the pillow like dark silk. She had always believed that truth was a shield, that if you told the truth and lived with integrity, justice would prevail. But sitting there in the soft glow of the nightlight, listening to the rain hammer against the windows, Margaret realized how naive that belief had been. The truth was a fragile thing, easily twisted, easily weaponized by those willing to lie without conscience. Eleanor Whitmore's testimony had been a masterpiece of deception, so detailed and delivered with such apparent sincerity that even Margaret had momentarily doubted her own memories, had wondered if perhaps she had been too controlling, too possessive without realizing it. Patricia called early the next morning with news that made Margaret's blood freeze in her veins. I did some digging on Eleanor Whitmore, the lawyer said, her voice tight with controlled anger. She received a payment of $50,000 6 months ago from an account registered to a shell corporation. I'm working on tracing the ownership, but I'd bet my career it leads back to Sarah or someone connected to her. Margaret felt rage course through her body, hot and cleansing, burning away the doubt and fear that had paralyzed her. Sarah hadn't just abandoned her children. She had spent 8 years building a false narrative, recruiting and paying a witness to testify against the one person who had actually raised them, actually loved them unconditionally. The second day of the hearing began with Patricia presenting evidence of Eleanor's payment, bank records that showed the money trail, leading to Sarah's new husband, a wealthy businessman named Richard Pemberton, who had apparently financed his wife's custody battle with the same casual indifference. He might fund a business acquisition. Judge Morrison's expression darkened as she reviewed the documents, her earlier skepticism of Margaret's character visibly shifting. Mr. Blackwell, does your client have an explanation for this financial transaction to a key witness in her case? The lawyer's polished confidence cracked, his arguments suddenly defensive, scrambling to explain away what was clearly witness tampering or at minimum deeply unethical behavior. Sarah took the stand again, and this time, under Patricia's relentless questioning, the facade began to crumble entirely. Why did your husband pay Eleanor Whitmore $50,000? Patricia demanded, her voice cutting through the courtroom like a blade. Sarah's composure shattered, tears streaming down her face. But they looked different now. Not tears of a suffering mother, but tears of someone whose carefully constructed lie was collapsing around her. You don't understand, Sarah sobbed. I couldn't come back, I was too ashamed. But I deserve another chance, they're my children, my blood. Margaret has had them for 8 years. Now it's my turn. The words revealed everything. This wasn't about what was best for Emma and Noah. It was about possession, about Sarah's sense of entitlement to children she had voluntarily abandoned. The judge called for closing arguments, and Margaret sat in the defendant's chair, her hands folded in her lap, watching Sarah across the courtroom. She saw clearly now what she had been too kind, too trusting to see 8 years ago. Sarah had always been weak, had always taken the easy path, and when motherhood became too difficult, when grief and responsibility became too heavy, she had simply walked away. And now, perhaps driven by guilt, perhaps by a new husband who wanted to create an instant family, she had decided to reclaim what she had discarded. Margaret thought of Emma's straight-A report cards, of Noah's soccer trophies, of the 1,000 bedtime stories and packed lunches and school plays and fevered midnights that had filled the past 8 years. She had earned these children in every way that mattered, not through biology, but through unwavering presence, through love that never wavered, through the daily choice to be there even when it was hard, even when she was exhausted, even when she wanted to give up. Judge Morrison promised a decision within 48 hours, and as the courtroom emptied, Margaret looked once more at Sarah and saw not an enemy, but a woman who had already lost everything that mattered and was too broken to even realize it. The 48 hours stretched into an eternity of waiting, each minute crawling by like a wounded animal. Margaret tried to maintain normalcy for Emma and Noah, making their favorite meals, helping with homework, pretending that their entire world wasn't hanging in the balance. Emma, old enough to understand the gravity of the situation, had stopped asking questions, her silence more devastating than any tears. Noah continued his routine with the resilience of childhood, but Margaret noticed how he checked constantly to make sure she was still there, still present, as if afraid she might vanish the way his mother had. The house felt like a temple in those final days, every moment sacred and precious, every interaction weighted with the possibility that it might be the last. On the morning of the third day, Patricia called with a voice that Margaret couldn't quite read, not jubilant, but not defeated either. "The judge wants to see everyone in chambers in an hour. She's ready to make her ruling." Margaret dressed the children carefully, Emma in her favorite blue dress, Noah in the suit they'd bought for his elementary school graduation. They drove to the courthouse in silence, the spring sunshine mocking the darkness that lived in Margaret's heart. Inside Judge Morrison's chambers, a space more intimate than the formal courtroom, they all gathered, Sarah and her expensive lawyer, Patricia and Margaret, and the two children who were the center of this entire storm. Judge Morrison looked at each of them in turn, her weathered face unreadable, before beginning to speak. "I have reviewed all the evidence, all the testimony, and spent considerable time contemplating what decision serves the best interests of these children. Mrs. Thompson, your abandonment of Emma and Noah was inexcusable. Your recent attempts to manipulate this court through paid testimony demonstrates a fundamental lack of character." Sarah's face crumbled, but the judge wasn't finished. "However, I cannot ignore the biological bond between mother and child. And I recognize that people can change, can heal, can deserve second chances." Margaret felt her heart stop, felt the world beginning to tilt toward nightmare. But then Judge Morrison turned to the children themselves, something Margaret had not expected. "Emma, Noah, you're old enough to have a voice in this decision. I've read the statements you gave to the court-appointed psychologist. Emma, you wrote that your grandmother is the only mother you remember, that she's been there for every important moment of your life. Noah, you said you don't want to live with a stranger, even if she's your biological mother." The judge's expression softened, almost imperceptibly. "The law gives parents significant rights, but it also requires me to consider what's in the children's best interest. 8 years is almost a lifetime for children this age. Margaret Harper has provided a stable, loving home. Sarah Thompson, despite whatever healing you've done, paid a witness to lie about the woman who raised your children. That action alone demonstrates you're not ready to put your children's needs before your own desires." The final ruling came like rain after a drought, washing away weeks of terror and uncertainty. Full custody is awarded to Margaret Harper, with supervised visitation rights for Sarah Thompson, to be evaluated after 1 year of consistent, appropriate contact. Margaret felt Patricia's hand squeeze hers, felt Emma and Noah rush into her arms, their small bodies shaking with relief. Across the chamber, Sarah collapsed into sobs, her expensive lawyer already gathering his papers, his work complete regardless of the outcome. Margaret held her grandchildren close, breathing in the familiar scent of their hair, feeling their hearts beat against her chest, and thought about all the forms love could take, biological, legal, but most powerful of all, the love forged through choice, through daily presence, through staying when everything in you wants to run. Sarah had given birth to these children, but Margaret had raised them, and in the end, the judge had recognized which bond mattered more. As they left the courthouse, stepping out into sunshine that now felt like blessing rather than mockery, Margaret knew that the past 8 years had been preparation for this moment, proof that sometimes the family you choose, the family you build through patience and sacrifice and unwavering devotion, is stronger than any biological tie could ever be.